Hi, my name is Kimmy. I'm here with Mere Skepticism. Mere Skepticism is about answering the doubts of people who are Christian and answering the questions or concerns or criticisms of people who are skeptical. And we know from walking out our front door, if any of us have any kind of involvement in social media, we see this rising tide of people who have left the church because of questions they have. And many of them are very open about the fact that we as a church didn't really give them room for their doubts or their questions. I think we need to learn from that. I think we need to do better. And I think we need to face the questions that are really difficult, which we're going to do today. So there's a lot of information and a lot of new voices coming out about slavery in ancient Israel. There are a lot of accusations about the God of ancient Israel and why he didn't say more and do more to stop this atrocity. So we're going to hit this head on. And I'm going to get into a little bit of a controversial area because in my study, and I had to dig pretty deep for this, what I found was there is a little bit of a cover-up going on in the Christian church. I don't believe most people that I encounter online know about this, but we have really misled some Christians to believe that no slavery in the Old Testament was chattel slavery, that none of it was about owning people. We have this really quick answer. I'm guilty of it as well, that we talk about, well, it was indentured servitude. It was they had the Jubilee where they were freed every 7 years, kind of trying to throw a coat of icing over a really ugly human history issue. So we need to first and foremost own that. And if you have any questions on it, and I tend to not love to throw people to atheists to answer their questions, but in this case, I think his character so far has been one that I would say that reading his material, I don't think he's out there to be responsible for a huge number of deconversions. I do think he'd be fine with it because he has himself gone from an position of conservative Christianity to then becoming, I believe he calls himself maybe an agnostic atheist. His name is Dr. Joshua Bowen. If you are in this topic at all, you've heard of him. He, and I got the book, The Atheist Handbook. He's also done quite a few interviews and podcasts on slavery. And his arguments are really solid, and we need to be grateful to people who are willing to look at this stuff. I'm sure he's gotten a lot of heat from people who love Jesus, love God, don't like the fact that he's doing this kind of work. But at the same time, I think it's really more important for us as Christians to be able to fully look at what the Old Testament was like and to be able to be honest about what it does contain. And it doesn't do us any good to stuff these things. Many of us had probably seen verses that didn't make a ton of sense in light of this whole idea of indentured servitude, how people literally would pay off their debts. It was really literally in a modern day term kind of a employment contract. But that's different than when they would go in and take people who were foreign slaves. And so we have to face that. And I'm not going to spend my time here doing all of that. I gave you a good resource. I also believe that Dr. Paul Copan, does some work in this area. I haven't gotten his new book. I'm planning on getting his new book, and I'm hoping that he covers some of this in a little bit more depth, because I think it is really important for us as Christians to be able to understand this issue of slavery. So how does all this reflect on God? The God of the Old Testament. If you're Jewish, if you're Christian, then we clearly have that same God who claims to be unchanging. So how do we answer this question of chattel slavery, brutal chattel slavery? There are stories in the scriptures about women that were taken from foreign lands and they were made into wives. You don't get the sense that these women were choosing that. You don't get the sense that the women were like, yeah, take me, I want to get married. So we're not only just talking about taking people as property, but we're also talking about sexual issues and other things. And I don't want to get too down deep into triggering subjects because I think it's sensitive, but I think it's reality and we need to be willing to look at some of this stuff. So the first thing that we have to ask ourselves, especially those of us that are in the faith, is the Bible a social justice document? Is that what it really is? Because if it really is, then this is a shattering revelation. And that would explain why we don't know about so much of it. Those of us that weren't doing the studies on the original text and weren't really digging into the Old Testament atrocities our whole life. What was the mindset of the people then? These are two really important questions. Well, first, I'm going to argue today that this is not a social justice document. In fact, it's quite the opposite of that. And I want to even think about when we get to the New Testament, when Jesus looks at the Pharisees and Sadducees and the people around him, he says, my kingdom is not of this world. And I believe that he was speaking to Pilate there, but I'm sorry if I can't remember exactly, but I'm assuming that's who he was talking to. So he had an audience, and he's saying, my kingdom isn't of this world, folks. I really think that that's a pertinent point to this argument. If his kingdom was of this world, you could, I'm not saying that it would go the whole way through, but you could make the argument that that was a failure. I don't think we're going to find any support for that idea. And yet, all I hear online, day in, day out, is your God is awful because he is not a social justice God. Well, if he claimed to be, that would be different. Now, there's some nuances to this, and anyone who really is seeking truth will stick with it. Anyone who really just wants to slam somebody for their beliefs is going to then just run away. And I'll tell you why, and I'll even share with you a blog from a skeptic, and it really pinpoints so many of the arguments against God based on the Old Testament. But we'll get to that. So what was the mindset? What was going on around them? Well, we know Rome had some laws on the book about war crimes and other things, but we also know they didn't generally follow it, and they certainly weren't held accountable to it. So we know that this is a barbaric time in history, right? We know that slavery was as much a part of the life, the economy, the moral landscape there as credit cards are for us, as fast food is for us, as blue jeans is if you're a Westerner. So when we think about that, they could do whatever they wanted to with slaves, right? They could do whatever they wanted to, and that was part of the Roman history. And that's when we're talking about Jesus. Before that, that was a part of the common culture, was slavery. But it wasn't just that slavery was a big deal back then, that it was normal, that it was common. It's also that worse things were being done in those times. And the reason I bring this up isn't to trigger you and say, oh, this is awful. It's really to kind of pull into sight that how many people want to pull modern morality into an Old Testament narrative and how it just doesn't work. So between 3100 and 2800 BC, we're in that range, right, of Old Testament writings. We know that's when child sacrifice became a thing. We know in Leviticus that the God of the Old Testament, even way back then, said that he would put people who did that to death. So even back then, that's over the line of what Yahweh was saying. That's cool. Now, but we also know that it happened in ancient Israel. We know that Solomon, in his later years, when he was turned away from the Lord, practiced in some of that. We know that in 2 Chronicles, the people of Judah has examples of that. We know in Jeremiah 32:35, and this is very telling, and this is a narrative where God is saying it never crossed his mind that they would start to do this in honor of other gods. Now, we can get all into omniscience. I don't believe that's a statement of God saying he was surprised by it. I think it's more of as often happens in the Old Testament, it's more of an illustration of how offensive this was. So we look at that and we say, okay, that's horrible. We know that today in Uganda, this is still being done. Human history is barbaric. Some areas of the world are still as barbaric, and I would argue even in modern places there is barbarism. It's just thinly veiled. So we know that in Proverbs it says that God hates the hands that shed innocent blood. So how does all this balance out? How do we deal with the fact that God isn't basically saying it's cool with me, but he's also not coming out and going, we need to, and he does with child sacrifice. There's that in Leviticus that basically says you're put to death if you do it. He doesn't do that with slavery. Well, why not? Okay, so first of all, we need to crawl into the mind of God to really answer that. But I think we can probably have some pretty good answers. When we think about that culture, that would have been so foreign to a culture to walk in and say, this thing that you're doing every day that you don't feel bad about, that everybody accepts, this is bad. Okay, So you can argue all you want that God could have done that. But if you do, you're going to argue it from the perspective of this is a social justice document. This is about how men were living. And while there are some Christian believers who that seems to be their most important point, that is not what we see as the most important point in the Old Testament. It is not what we see as God's agenda. When he says, I am not of this world is not my kingdom, what he's saying is, I'm in this world, but what you guys think my agenda is not my agenda. And if we look at the whole of slavery in this time, I would argue that people weren't ready to give this up. Just like they weren't willing to give up a lot of things about how they treated women as property, or how they dealt with education, or the inequity between the ruling class and the slaves. There's a lot of things about this culture that God did not go on YouTube and start preaching against. But what did God do? What was God doing in the midst of all of this? Essentially, what God is doing is he is protecting the Davidic line, which ultimately will deliver Jesus to the world. He is protecting it. At every turn, when you think about all the things that skeptics and doubters struggle with, and it's honest struggle, I'm not downplaying it. But when God does things with other people groups, when he protects Israel, sometimes it is at the expense of other people. Absolutely. Now, you can argue whether or not that's God's right. You can argue whether or not he could have done it differently, but you're going to argue from a position of no foundation, because you're not God. You don't know all that God knows. And at the end of the day, you don't know what decisions God will make that will net the most people to come to accept him, or the timeline for that. So we need to really step back. And when a skeptic is going at why Jesus himself, or in this case of the Old Testament and slavery, God himself, isn't all about social justice, the answer is, you're right. He wasn't. He does have a lot to say about how we treat each other. I believe, and we're going to get into it in a little bit here, a lot of atheists say, Jesus was anti-progressive. He was never progressive. I'm going to make an argument that I think that will hold water, that you can use to kind of say, yeah, that's not really true. So the question becomes then, if slavery is a part of everyday life, if child sacrifice is still in the world, if we have all of these inequities and all of these awful things, and again, throughout all of this, there are many verses about the love of God, the patience of God, the heart of man. I'm thinking about an Ezekiel verse that I think is really powerful, and please bear with me here because I've got all my research notes. But basically, it's when God, I believe, gives us this picture of what it is to be a non-social justice, protecting the Davidic line, but still moving us forward. And that is the Ezekiel verse, and I apologize because I'm struggling finding it right here, but it's the one about removing the heart of stone. What he's going to do is remove the heart of stone and replace it with a heart of flesh. So what does that mean? It means that in these ancient times, I believe it's safe to say that man had a heart of stone about many things, about daily life. And maybe that's because at the end of the day, they were tired and hungry and beat up. I don't know, but they had a heart of stone. And over time, and I would argue in the new covenant, that heart of stone was replaced with a heart of flesh. And at the end of the day, we have to realize that God himself was moving us forward. But he wasn't moving us forward so that we could be all fat and happy today. He was moving us forward so that we could have the salvation invitation that Jesus Christ brought to the whole world, Gentiles, Jews, everybody. So we're understanding that this kind of mindset of humanity in this time, slavery and everything else, and war crimes, they were all part of every single day. So I would say that if we move forward past the Old Testament, so we made that argument, it was not about social justice. It's about preserving the Davidic line. And slavery was just the mindset of the people. And he didn't argue against every barbaric mindset. And to be fair, that would have been more than likely fallen on deaf ears. When people are at that level, when that is the world they live in, we are wise to know what people can handle and what they can't. I know that sounds like it's a cobbled answer, but the reality is when you have child sacrifice here, women being brutally assaulted in many different ways, you have such inequity, you have hunger and people being publicly executed for crime, you're not looking at a people whose heart is ready for social justice reform. I just think that's a solid argument. And I don't sit down and read my 2-year-old grandson War and Peace. I don't read to him the Declaration of Independence. I don't bring a lot of things because what I do is meet him where he is. Now, the skeptic would say that's because God basically wasn't big enough to handle the problem. And I would say I am more than capable of explaining War and Peace or any other classic novel or the Declaration of Independence. But why would I do that to someone who's not ready for those messages? Why would I do that? Does that make me less capable? Does that make me less equipping, less loving to say, I'm going to meet people where they are? I believe that is what our God did, was he met the people where they were. And yes, it is hard to look at from our supposedly evolved mindset. And the skeptic who wants to give God no grace in that won't, and they can use it as a reason to reject him. But if you're a person of faith, I think that it would be foolish for you to assume that you get to tell God what his role was. You get to tell God what people were capable of. And if he doesn't step up to your expectation, you just reject him. And that's my feeling on what happens with a lot of people who look at these kinds of issues, is they just set him up. They set up a straw man of God and he doesn't make the cut. Well, maybe God isn't going to respond to our model for him. So does Jesus then come along and just throw the social justice into it? And this is where we're going to get into a little bit of a misalignment, I believe, of what's happening when people want to dog God for not being social justice, or they want to say that Jesus wasn't progressive. And it's, again, very similar to what happens with looking at the way we look at the Old Testament. So if we look at it and we say, did he move people forward? I'm going to answer solidly yes, and let me tell you why. He basically went from this very brutal culture, and he teaches things that to us seem absolutely lovely, but not terribly controversial or progressive. Love your enemies. Now, back then, you didn't love your enemies, folks. That's not what they were doing, right? That's not the mindset. You were conquering your enemies. You were enslaving your enemies. You weren't loving them. You were loving your neighbor as yourself. So we know Jesus taught these things. In this culture, this is a big deal. This is a big step forward. Forgiving other people, even when they don't ask to be forgiven, right? Serving other people, that's a big deal. I mean, do you serve people that you're not enslaved by? I'm going to argue that's probably not something that they thought of every day. And he also talked about having faith, right? I believe faith is trust in what we do know. Jesus was teaching, you do these things, and I guarantee you, in the mindset of the people he was teaching, they knew that to do those things meant they had to have faith. They had to believe God for something, because this was not normal stuff. Now, I am not saying that he went around saying slavery was wrong, that we needed to have amendments to the local laws for women so that they had equal opportunity in the workplace, or had a vote, or even could decide how they wanted to live, or could afford to provide for themselves. Would there be a lot of space for what it could have been done for minorities and women, foreigners, etc.? Absolutely. Is that Jesus's goal? We know he went healing. We know he went teaching. We know he preached to people that were considered untouchable, right? We know that that was the heart of this God, this man, fully God, in the Christ Jesus. We know that was his heart and character. That still doesn't mean that he was about social justice. So I think the question really comes down to, we don't reach people by telling them things that they're not ready to hear. If his job as the savior of the world was also to be a social justice warrior, I would say that we would probably have a decent argument to say he probably should have covered some of those topics. Just don't think that that's even on the list of things that Jesus was there to accomplish. And it's certainly not what the prophets said he was there to accomplish, and it certainly isn't what he said to Pilate, and it certainly isn't what he said when he gets into the differences between what was and what is. And by that, like if we look at Matthew 15:11, he says it's not what we eat that makes us sinners, right? It's not that defiles us. The word defile means mars us, marks us, spoils us. So it's what comes out of us, right? And what comes out of us is from here. So what we're thinking is really what defiles us. What we are doing in our heart about other people, that's what defiles us. That was extraordinarily progressive, if that's the word that you're looking for, in a time when, I mean, just go back and look at how many things in Scripture, Old Testament Scripture, were about what you put in your body or on your body or how you put it on or when you put it on. So here we're going to get into the disagreement between a skeptic and myself, okay? So this is a blog called Only Sky. It's well done. They have some great arguments, some wonderful stuff in here. But he basically is hammering this idea that Jesus was a progressive. So we've gone from the Old Testament argument, we've talked about why it's not a social justice document, that God met the people where they were, and yes, it was heinous, but at the end of the day, that entire scenario was simply a part of a greater scheme to bring us to a place of salvation. It wasn't to absolve humanity from its barbaric roots. It's just not. So when we think about what Only Sky is saying, he says that the Christian church is a quietist church. So what he's saying is we're not progressive at all. We can't give Jesus any credit for that. We as a church just go along with what's happening. Now let's look at this a little closer, okay? He uses a conservative view, and he says that evangelicals oppose safety nets. This is an example of why we're quietists. In other words, so he says Jesus was not moving us forward. Even the things I just talked about that move things from external to internal, that's not progressive. He's saying that Jesus wasn't advocating an overthrow, which we've already covered, right? When we said that basically he was saying to Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. He's not advocating a change of the culture on earth. He's advocating a change in here. He's advocating a change of the church, that we would turn ourselves and repent and honor him. And he's offering us eternity. That's the agenda that God and Jesus on earth had for us. That's where the skeptics get lost. That's where they miss who Jesus actually was and who God of the Old Testament. And let's face it, I can't really blame them. If you look anywhere online, you are only going to see the really atrocious things that are in verse, that are in story, and that are commands. You're not going to see all of the other stuff where God is patient, he is waiting, he rejoices over us and singing, he loves the creation of humanity. But yes, it has been a long and torturous fight to get that Davidic line where it is. And he had to do that to preserve free will. Not a Calvinist, so if you're a Calvinist, you're going to disagree with this, but at the end of the day, it preserved free will and the sovereignty of God. That's that middle line. So basically what Only Sky is saying is, if the Christian church were truly progressive, they would stop opposing safety nets in our government, social programs. Did you hear that? So essentially, the definition of this individual skeptic is that the Christian church would be progressive if they did what he or she, I'm sorry, I don't know who the author is. I read their stuff. I don't know if it's a group of people or one writer. I can figure that out. If you have a question, shoot me a DM and I'll find that out. But what they're saying is, to be progressive, you got to do it my way. To be progressive, you have to be like me, right? That's what that is what they're saying. Now, as someone who is a conservative, not a religious conservative, I know there's a lot of different ways that we look at that. I'm only conservative because that's my college education, and I believe that smaller government is more direct and closer to the people. That's it. I don't have people that I adore. I don't worship the government. And I also believe, because I've done enough research on it, and it is, as I said, what my degree is in, is that there are a lot of people who have had that kind of safety net provided for them that say it's the worst thing that ever happened to them. I'm not getting into politics here. Everybody has their right to how they believe the government should operate. We shouldn't be forcing it on other people. We all should vote. But my point isn't that I'm right on this. My point is that his point falls apart unless you agree that his way is the only way to help humans. And I would argue that the tone is, if that isn't your way, then you're not really trying to help humans. So do you see the arrogance in that? So no, Christians are not progressive if Christians have to do and believe and operate and have the same political view you do to be considered progressive. That's the answer. And so all the while, what's happening is that they ignore that it has to look like they look in order to be progressive. I don't think that many people are going to argue that Jesus was not revolutionary in the way that he viewed humans and how humans should view human to human. If you cherry pick through the scriptures, then you probably could hold that view. But it would be hard not to see that historically as well. And skeptic scholars will very often agree that Jesus had a very unique and forward-thinking perspective on how humans should treat other humans. So at the end of the day, God had the right to make his history in humanity about protecting the Davidic line. He did. And there was a lot of carnage going on. A lot of it had nothing to do with Israel or Yahweh or anything else to do with the underpinnings of the Christian faith or the Jewish faith, for that matter. There was a lot going on in the world. Had nothing to do with us. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't, from our perspective, heinous and difficult, hard to understand. There's a lot, and I think a Christian has to own that, just like we have to own a lot of other things if we've been part of a church that has made mistakes in our culture today. Well, ideally, it would have been nice in a perfect universe if God could have been both a social justice warrior and protect the Davidic line and protect women and all these other things. But oh, what a position of arrogance to think that we have in our hands the possession of knowledge to know that he could have done that and delivered Jesus, who offered us eternity, Jew and Gentile, in the whole world. That there's an arrogance to that. There's an arrogance that says, which is often something that I post on my social media, which is we think and we reject God because he does not stand up to what we expect him to be. And we really deep down think we could do a better job than him. And I'm just not going to jump on that bandwagon, even if some of this horrible and painful and difficult history that all humanity shares, I will point out, every faith, I don't care if you're pagan, you're atheist, you are serving in any other faith, you're Muslim, you're Buddhist, so no matter what, this is a shared human barbaric history. That isn't whataboutism. Well, they're bad too. That's not what this is. This is saying we have a shared barbaric history as humans. We need to own up to it. But it certainly doesn't follow that we have to say, well, God didn't do what I want him to do. He didn't make the Bible about social justice and making life on earth better. And I'm going to leave you with this. When Paul says, your suffering is this small little sliver, but how does it compare in light of eternity? Those of us who have had people we love who have struggled for an entire lifetime with pain, with suffering, with mental health issues, that sometimes isn't the easiest verse to hear, right? We don't know what Paul's struggles were, but it's kind of tempting to go, I'm not sure, Paul, you know what you're saying. But when compared in the light of eternity, I don't think he was wrong. And I think most of us who believe that there is a first cause, there is a God, and that he revealed himself in the person of Jesus Christ, and he did invite us to eternity. I think at some point we have to realize that we aren't him. We don't know what everything that has to fall together, and my belief is that everything that does fall together is so that the optimum number of people will choose to be with God for eternity, because anything less than that is he's not all good. If he's not all good, then all definitions are up in play. So if he is all good, his goal is that the most people would come to know him. And if this is what it looks like, including slavery, including misogyny, including a lot of other things that are really difficult about the barbaric history of humanity, I'm not going to sit here in my little home office and say, oh, I could do better than that, God. You just failed. But that is what the skeptic says. They say, you could have done better. You didn't meet my expectations, so I reject everything. And sadly, a lot of people will do it just based on someone else's testimony, and they'll never look through all the beautiful things God did to preserve the Davidic line, and all the times that he taught us through his love of that line and the love of his people so that we could have Jesus and Jesus could do what Jesus did. They miss all the other aspects, and they have a very unbalanced view of who God is. I hope that some of this has helped you today. It's a tough subject. I'm not trying to sugarcoat it. If you have questions, shoot me a DM. I'm on Twitter and I'm on Instagram under the same name, Mere Skepticism. Love to hear from you. I hope you have a great rest of your day. It was a little longer today. I actually had more stuff researched, believe it or not, but I don't think everybody wants to sit in their car for an hour. So I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.